Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
All right, well, thanks for joining us on another edition of American Potential. We always love to bring stories of great policy champions, and you're gonna hear from one today who you recognize, and someone that you see probably quite a lot on television, and really a true champion on so many issues for Americans for prosperity. So we're excited to have this guest today. Today's guest is a husband, a dad of 3, and was raised by a single mom who instilled in him the desire to leave future generations better than the current generation. He graduated from Florida State University, then went on to work in the banking, finance, and insurance industry. And in 2008, he was asked by the company that he was working for to figure out what was going on in the economy. So he turned on a House Financial Services Committee hearing, and he wasn't very impressed with what he was hearing from elected officials. This led him to start researching and reading books such as The Law by Frederick Bastiat. And through this process, he learned why our government was formed the way that it was. Well, he was first elected to Florida's House of Representatives in 2016, where he chaired the Insurance and Banking Subcommittee. And in 2020, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives, where he now sits on the Oversight and Accountability Committee, Financial Services Committee, and the House Steering Committee as the Speaker designee. If you've ever heard him on the House floor or in a committee hearing, you know he doesn't really shy away from asking hard questions or making tough statements. I want to welcome Congressman Byron Donalds, who proudly represents Southwest Florida's House District 19. Congressman, thanks for being with us. How are you today?
I'm doing good. It's good to be with you.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us. First of all, I know that one issue that really is both you and your wife are very heavily involved in is the issue of school choice, educational choice, and the importance of empowering parents. Would love to hear your thoughts on the great work that you and your wife have done. In fact, somebody told me that your wife's the real power broker. Is that right?
Some people might say that. She probably would agree. For us, education's really just been, it's been everything. Education's how we were able to get started and, really changing our lot in life from being young kids, who grew up poor to really being able to achieve a lot of things in our professional career. We were both working in finance, and about 12 years ago now, we were approached about helping to start a charter school. And, I was always passionate about education because I know what it meant for me and she knows what it meant for her. And so we decided to just roll up our sleeves and help. And that school got started. It's still in operations to this day. And then, she got the bug. She ran for school board, became a school board member. And when I went to the state legislature, one of the things I worked on outside of financial issues were education issues at the state level. So, did everything from, passing legislation that allowed parents and community members to review school books and materials that were in school classrooms, to working on the Hope Scholarship Bill, which provided an avenue for kids who were being abused or bullied in their school environment to get a scholarship to go somewhere else. And it was always about just making sure that you had a real economy for education. I know that, people are frustrated with public schools. I was frustrated with public schools. Like my mom was frustrated with my public school. That's why she pulled me out. She was probably one of the first school choice moms, was my mom. Mm-hmm. And, I think the path forward after really looking through a lot of the policy issues was, let's just give parents the ability to make these decisions for themselves, give them that purchasing power. And, the way I always equated it was, a long time ago, the government, in the early 80s, the government, they made a decision that they were no longer going to be providing food. They would just give people a coupon to go buy food. And a funny thing happened. It was more efficient, and there's issues in that program, don't get me wrong, but it was more efficient than just the government giving out cheese and peanut butter. And so if the government thought it was important enough for food, why is it not as important for education? And that's kind of the work that drives her, more so her now than me, obviously being in Washington. But it's a passion project that we both share.
Yeah. Well, and, there's no reason why the free market won't help us make better decisions. Everybody can make a decision that's in their own best interest. Parents will do that if given the opportunity. So that's really great. And God bless you and your wife for the continued work in that area. So in 2008, when you listened to your first congressional hearing, do you remember what was being said that made you to kind of do your own research?
Honestly, it was a lot of what wasn't said. The members didn't really understand what was happening in the financial system. Very few members were really talking about the fact that it was the underwriting standards that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac allowed with respect to what they would buy in terms of mortgages or what they would back in terms of mortgages. That's what really created the environment that led to our financial collapse. And you had a lot of members, unfortunately, who were blaming the big banks. And as somebody who got their start in banking, what was happening on the ground didn't line up with what was being said in these committee hearings. And, it just pissed me off. Right. And I just really couldn't understand why people who were supposed to have all the information, be our leaders, be our experts, they knew less than I knew. It probably still occurs for a lot of Americans today. And so I think that's the real frustration people have. And so, I'm not one to complain a lot. Like if you see an issue, try to learn and do something about it. And so, it just really started me down a journey that really has taken me to Congress.
Right. So did that lead you to read The Law by Bastiat?
Well, actually, what happened there was, after being frustrated with what was going on, I started watching a lot of news and trying to figure out and understand politics and what was going on politically. And around the same time, that's when the Tea Party rallies started happening across the country. And so, I saw an ad for one and I said, I'll just go and see what's going on here. A lot of people at the time, the media was calling them racists. And so I was like, well, I'm going to just find out for myself. I'm not just going to listen to what somebody says on the news or what somebody else tells me. And so when I was there, I met a couple people, and one of them recommended that I read The Law. And they were like, this would actually be a really good book if you really want to understand more about conservatism and frankly, the thought of basic law and what it means for a civil society. So I took that, read it, and it was really eye-opening to me. It actually explained a lot. It clarified a lot of what our issues were, in the United States, which are still issues today. In some respects have gotten worse. And, from there, it just took me down that journey of finding out that I was actually a conservative and probably pretty conservative. And it was crazy at the time, because at the time you're just thinking, I'm just a guy. I read this book. All right, I got to go back to work. I got to take care of my family. Right. But what it really did, it helps me start to really engage in politics on the local level and kind of get a chance to meet a lot of the players at the time who were involved politically and what they were doing and what they were passionate about. And I was really just learning the many aspects of not like electioneering and campaign politics, but just politics in general and the big dichotomy between, liberty and tyranny or conservatism and liberalism, or however you want to phrase it.
Right. Now, because you had this background in banking and finance, I mean, that must really have shapes your view currently, I'm sure, on the economy and what's happening in the economy. It's always great to have people who've been in an industry to help, oversee that industry. And that's what you're doing in Congress. But how does that shape your view of what's happening?
Well, I think it was really helpful because I had a background in economics and the background in how our financial system works before I ever really thought about our political system and how the implications of what happens in the political system impacts our economic system. So, one of the books, one of the things I did is I watched, a bunch of the YouTube clips with Free to Choose with Milton Friedman. And I would sit there and watch those debates. Great. And they were interesting to me because, growing up in the inner city, there was a cross section of, maybe some of the issues that liberals on those shows were trying to address. But then you could also see the downsides that conservatives, or in the case of Milton Friedman, libertarians would bring as the downside results of these policies that were being pushed. And it was able to really help me focus. My economic background, my economic mindset helped me understand politics and actually helped shape my politics to a large degree. I say to a lot of people, if it don't make dollars, it don't make sense. And that's really because, you can design any political system or any political program you want, but if it doesn't begin to take on its own inertia and be able to sustain itself economically, then all it's going to do is be a drain on money that is borrowed in the future. It's going to be a drain on other people's desires to go out and innovate. It's going to be a drain on our economy. And that's not a successful project. So I kind of always look at things politically through that lens. If it's sustainable economically, then it's something that makes sense politically. And then you can go from there.
Right. You mentioned the Milton Friedman series, the Free to Choose series. And I have gone back on YouTube, and I'd encourage anybody listening to go do that and watch those. What always strikes me when I watch those, and they're certainly dated. Everybody's wearing big ties and big collars, right? But the debate, you don't see that kind of a debate much on TV anymore. And it's kind of refreshing to see that, the back and forth, and Milton Friedman never backed down. I just loved watching him in those. They were super great. What do you think? One of the things we try to focus on this podcast are the ways in which government sets up barriers and impediments to people's success. And I think we're seeing that in the economy for sure right now. The government, tell us some of the ways you think the government is slowing down the economy and really the quality of life for the citizens.
I'm gonna need more than 20 minutes, man. We got a lot to cover.
That's right.
I'll start with the big stuff and try to work my way down into a couple. Sure. The first is, the actual mechanism of quantitative easing at the Federal Reserve. I think that this is something that's caused significant issues in our economy because it has devalued the purchasing power of the individual dollar. One of the great misconceptions in our politics is that, the rich are always getting everything and the poor get nothing and they get stepped on. But the reality is that it's the destruction of purchasing power by quantitative easing or printing money, however you want to phrase it. That's more destructive of the poor than anything else. Yeah. I never want to abridge anybody from being rich. Shoot, be rich. That's cool. When I leave politics, I want to go make money too. But if every dollar buys less product, everybody suffers, especially the poor. And so that's why printing money, quantitative easing is a significant issue. The second big thing is we've been in this situation for the last 14 years. The Fed kept interest rates at basically zero. And what that does, it makes money so easy to borrow that nobody makes actual economic decisions. They're just, basically playing interest rate decisions. Well, that doesn't produce a economy that has a drive in and of itself. It's an economy based on massive amount of stimulus, and any economy based on that amount of stimulus at some point is going to hit major issues. Who gets crushed by that? Once again, it's the poor. When it comes to financial regulation, the worst thing we've done in our country, in my view, is the Dodd-Frank Act after the 2008 recession. We were told by the pundits that it was going to stop too big to fail, that the big banks were going to be brought to heel, too big to fail will be over, and it would save our economy. Well, actually, the opposite has occurred. The big banks have gotten massively bigger. Community banking has basically been eviscerated to the tune of 70% in the past 13, 14 years. And so who does that hurt? Once again, people at the bottom. People who are trying to build businesses, trying to find access to capital. Well, there's not as many banks as there used to be. And there's definitely not as many small community banks who would take a risk on a mom and pop venture. Whereas Bank of America or Wells Fargo or Citi, they're not going to do that. So, when my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, when they like to talk about, regulation is needed to save the consumer, what regulation actually does is it stops the innovator. It stops that that person in the middle of our economy or at the bottom of our economy from trying to rise. And what you find is the large companies, they have more than enough money to deal with the regulation. The rich, they have more than enough money to deal with the regulation, and they go on. I'll give you another one, tax policy. Our tax system is so convoluted. The only way you could really take advantage of it is if you have a tax accountant. Well, who suffers from that? People at the lower end. Furthermore, the government says, oh, we missed out on all this money. So they want to hire all these new agents, 87,000 new IRS agents. But who are they going to go after? They're going to go after middle income Americans. They're going to go after the poor. Why? Because the federal government is trying to find every penny possible to pay for its profligate spending. And so who suffers under that is the poor. We could talk about energy policy. If you decide that we have to save the planet because of climate change, okay, that's a noble goal. But how are you going about doing it? We are essentially buying solar panels and wind turbines from China. They're our greatest adversary on the globe. Well, what happens when you substitute coal for solar? Coal is significantly cheaper than solar power is. Solar power is heavily subsidized, more so than coal or natural gas is. And so if you want to go follow green, renewable energy, the energy on the electric grid is going to be more expensive. Well, who suffers from more expensive energy? Once again, it's the poor. I mean, like I said, I could go on and on and on. But the reality is that we have to find a way, politically speaking, for Americans to understand that the path to prosperity for all of us is not found in government regulation and government programming. It's found with unleashing the American people to pursue their own interests, to pursue wealth. And yes, pursuing wealth is a good thing, to innovate, and to have all the different tools and abilities to build wealth for their families, which is also a very good thing.
Yeah. And, you raise such a good point when we talk about some of these policies, these economic policies of the Biden administration. They really are hurting the middle class and the less fortunate among us. Those are the people that pay. I mean, you just take inflation. That's not going to hurt someone who is making millions of dollars a year, but it is going to hurt that single mom out there who's, just trying to make ends meet. And that's an important point. And I think it's been lost in the debates in Washington.
Oh, listen, first of all, are there debates in Washington? That's a better way to put it. Right. One of the issues I've seen, being a member of Congress for a couple of years now is the members, we really don't debate these issues. And it's really, it's really how the place is structured. Every member of Congress gets their 5 minutes to do their speech or their talk or their questions. There's hardly anybody else that's even in the committee hearings to hear them. On the floor, most of the members are not there when we're actually debating a bill. Again, somebody's recognized for a minute or 2 minutes and they give their speech about what's going on, but the other side does not listen. There's actually very little debate in Washington, which is eye-opening to me, having served at the state level, where the members are all present in committee and on the floor. You have very vigorous debates on these issues. That does not occur in Washington. It's actually something that I think we should change, in this. But before we took over the House, is one of the things I recommended. A lot of the members didn't agree with me, but I recommend it because if you have more vigorous debate about these issues, it actually will help to clarify a lot of things between the members of Congress, and actually good policy would follow for the American people. Yeah.
What most surprised you between as you were a candidate or before when you were in the legislature and then getting to Congress? What surprised you most about being in Washington, D.C. and being in Congress?
Really how toxic it is, how toxic the environment is, how little Republicans and Democrats actually talk to each other. Like it's really eye-opening. Like you have to go out of your way to try to talk to a Democrat for a Democrat to talk to a Republican. I mean, we mostly pass each other in the halls. We're in elevators. We don't say much to each other. Like I said, in the committee rooms, we barely talk to one another. On the floor, if you ever see the House floor, typically the Republicans are on one side, the Democrats on the other side, and the two shall not cross, the middle aisle. It was very rare for somebody to cross the middle aisle just to have a conversation. It's a very partisan environment. Forget the politics. The environment is partisan. And I think in part that's because, when I first went for orientation, the Democrats did their orientation, the Republicans did their orientation. the new members were hardly ever in a room together. We were up there for 10, 14 days. I think we might have all been in the same room for like 2 or 3 sessions. And in those rooms, you're in this big auditorium and you're just being lectured to. There's no engagement. There's no dialogue. Mm-hmm. And, I think that's really one of the more concerning things about what's happening in Washington. Like, if you don't know your colleagues by first name, how could you ever sit down and figure out what you could work on?
Yeah. Have you been able to break that down on a personal level? I mean, are there Democrats that you've gotten to talk to? And, you may not agree on policy, but you can talk about kids. You can talk about the hobbies, things you like to do.
Yeah. I mean, there's some, I think probably the most famous example is, Jamal Bowman and I on the steps of the Capitol going back and forth. But the only reason why that could even occur is because Jamal and I talk about football. When we see each other, usually we talk about football. Jared Moskowitz of Florida, we serve together in the Florida House. So when I see Jared, we talk, we engage. We know we have political disagreements, but then we also can try to find other things that we could work on. Nikema Williams of Georgia, she and I knew each other when we were in the state legislature. She was in the legislature in Georgia. I was in Florida. And so we know each other from that time. But it's really difficult. Like, I think the number one thing is just being cordial to people when you see them. Try to talk to them and engage with them. But it's different. It's really different in Washington. It's pretty difficult to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think that really breaks down. If you can get someone to understand you and talk to you about other things, then that'll take the edge off a little bit, and you may be able to talk about solutions for America. And so that's important. And I think it has become a very toxic environment. No doubt about it. Let me ask you on inflation. You talked about inflation and how much that's hurting the American people. What can we do? Now we obviously know that we overspend. So that's a big thing we've been doing for decades now. But what are some of the things that we can do and Congress can do and the president can do to help reduce inflation?
Look, the number one thing is you got to cut excessive spending. I think, inflation's been something that's always been talked about. And really what happened was, Joe Biden wanted to have his stimulus package with his name on it and early on in his presidency. And that amount of money going to our economy that fast is what started the inflation. And you couple it with the fact that people were being paid to stay home, and then you created a labor shortage. So they created a labor shortage at the same time they were pumping vast amount of money into the economy, and voila, there goes your inflation, and then it just sparks. So the number one thing is it's always about the velocity of money from the government going into our economy. So if you don't want to have rampant inflation, we got to control spending. In Washington, the biggest problem I see is everybody just wants to continue to spend, but nobody wants to really evaluate the efficacy of what they're spending money on. Like, okay, we're giving you $10 billion. Did it actually work before I give you another $2 billion? If it didn't work, I'm not giving you anything. And, that sounds normal in everybody's life or everybody's business. But you say that in Washington and, it's almost like you have leprosy. People don't even know how to handle that. So there's a lot of that has to get done. The second piece is, as members, and I got some homework assignments I got to do about this in real time, but we have to go through these federal agencies and really understand if what they are spending money on doesn't even work anymore. Has it lived past its purpose? Do they need to continue to do that? And if you do, what are the more efficient ways to get it accomplished? I think that's a big second thing. The third thing is we're going to have to figure out a long-term debt issue. We can't just continue to borrow money at this rate, because that's going to create another inflation cycle that could be even more damaging, in my view, than the current one we're dealing with right now.
Yeah. You mentioned the exact reason for inflation, and everybody knows it. In fact, we talked about freedom to choose in Milton Friedman, and he defines what causes inflation in Free to Choose, which is, too much money chasing too few goods. And you talked about COVID. Coming out of COVID, it had both of those, right? A stimulus bill that put too much money into the economy, coupled with supply chain issues and too few products. I mean, it was really the perfect recipe for a disaster, correct?
No, it was. And I was on the budget committee when this was going through. And, we told we were telling congressional Democrats, like, this is what's going to happen. Don't do this. This is a bad idea. But we didn't have the votes. And, elections do have consequences. We didn't have the votes to stop it. And it really, really set back so many Americans for multiple years. And, I know the talking points now is, the inflation is coming down. Well, that's not true. The inflation rate is coming down, but the impact of the inflation on higher prices remains. Like, those higher prices are there. They're now sticky, if you will. They're not transitory the way that it was told to the American people early on. And that's going to create its own set of economic issues we're going to have to contend with.
Yeah, and I think the American people are smart enough to understand that. It's a little bit of trying to change expectations. They'll say things like the price of gas has come down. Well, it isn't anywhere near where it was when Joe Biden took office. Yeah. So we shouldn't just accept that. And it could be much lower if we had better government policies on energy, right?
Not could, would. It would be much lower if we had better governmental policies. But again, I think a lot of this is by design. It's being done on purpose. You have a desire from people on the left side of our politics to, quote unquote, save the planet. And so for some of them, they believe to do that by any means necessary. But the means upon which they want to use is the pocketbooks of every American. They have no problem driving up costs for everybody to accomplish their goal. But we were in a hearing one day, and I said to a bunch of these guys, I was like, listen, you want to spend $4 to $5 trillion chasing renewable energy to possibly cut the global climate by 0.5 degree in 30 years. And I say possibly, because we spend all this money and they don't even know if it'll actually happen. That's a bad business deal as far as I'm concerned. I'm not giving you that kind of money for a maybe 30 years down the line or 20 years down the line. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Now, you served on the budget committee. Tell us, what should Congress do when it comes to the budget? I mean, there's got to be lots of reforms in the process that would truly make a difference.
Well, it was actually just said by a colleague of mine that if companies budgeted the way Congress budgets, these companies will go to jail for embezzlement. So let's start there. I think our budget process is a joke. It makes no sense. It's politically driven to hide pockets of money for people to be able to pass stuff and get it done. The first couple things are, one, we absolutely need a balanced budget amendment that actually caps, now this is the key point now, caps tax rates. Because a pure balanced budget amendment would mean, you could raise taxes and that should raise, and so on a model basis that balances. The problem when you raise taxes, it dries up economic activity, and that causes its own problems again, for the American people. So I think you got to have a balanced budget amendment that puts cap limitations on tax rates. There has to be an ongoing process where agencies and their various departments are being reviewed on a continuous basis. So much of the federal budget is controlled by what we call the budget baseline. So if you spent $1 trillion last year, you adjust for inflation, you might spend 1 trillion, 500 billion this year. And then they say, okay, you're just continuing consistent spending. Well, no, the spending's going up because you're increasing the baseline. And in Washington, if you were supposed to spend 1 trillion, 500 billion, but you only spent $1 trillion, 200 billion, they call that a cut. That's how Washington speaks.
Right.
But that's not what the American people say. If you spend $200 billion more, you didn't cut spending. You just increased it at a lower rate. So that's the kind of stuff that's got to be fixed. If you can do that, it goes a long, long way. The last piece is, yes, we are going to have to reform Social Security and Medicare. There are ways to do it that protect people who are on these benefits right now, seniors. There's a way to do that. You could do it in a constructive way, but the political dogma associated with it really stops people from understanding that we can solve these problems and get our country on a healthy track. But you got to have the political will to do so. And at the end of the day, that only really comes from the voters. Last thing that really concerns me, at the current pace, interest on our debt, paying interest will be more than paying for our Defense Department. it will be the number one line item in our budget. When your country gets to that level, that's just simply unsustainable. And that's to the detriment of the entire United States.
Yeah. Wow. That should be sobering to every American to hear that, for sure. Congressman, we just got a minute here left, but why are people so hesitant in Congress to change the budget process?
Well, honestly, I think it's because they're not concerned how citizens will react to it. A lot of my colleagues, and listen, I respect them. They work hard. They represent their districts too. But it's not even about the actual programs we're spending money on. It's about what does it mean back home? Will somebody run a negative ad against them? How will they be able to, message this to constituents? And I find that if you do the right thing and you have reasons for that and you can explain that and it makes sense, like, again, it makes dollars and it makes sense, then your voters will reward you, because the American people are tired of Washington doing what Washington has always done. They want people to go make the hard choices and get our country on track. And I think if you can demonstrate that, then we can be successful. And I think the other piece of this is, and this is really a problem in all of our politics, not just budgeting, is our media is a joke. I mean, it's just ridiculous. The things that they focus on and the things that they choose not to focus on are one of the reasons why our country is so divided. And so we have to do a significantly better job of getting the real information, facts, and truth to the American people, and stop with the political dogma, which just divides us for no reason.
Congressman Byron Donalds, first of all, thanks for joining us today, but most importantly, thanks for being such a great policy champion and really a patriot for America, trying to solve some of these very difficult problems they're hurting every single American. But thank you for joining us today.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.